Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the U.S. Department of Education and PTAC webinar entitled Best Practices for Access Controls and Disclosure Avoidance Techniques. Today's webinar will provide an overview of the guidance documents around data disclosure avoidance and best practice strategies for protecting personally identifiable information from education records in aggregate records. This webinar will provide suggestions on how to ensure that necessary confidentiality requirements are met, including compliance with the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, better known as FERPA. With me today is Michael Hawes, the Statistical Privacy Advisor at the U.S. Department of Education, and I'm Baron Rodriguez, and I direct the activities of the Privacy Technical Assistance Center. This webinar will be approximately 1 hour. And we want to remind folks to please enter any questions that you have throughout the presentation, and we will be tracking those and try and answer as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. We do have extra time, so please do feel free to ask your questions, and we'll try to get to them during the end of the webinar. We will be recording this webinar. It will be available on the PTAC website in approximately 2 weeks. And just a reminder that this webinar is only intended to provide a preview of recently released documents and will not be a comprehensive review of these documents that we're going to be talking about today. So please do go to our website at ptac.ed.gov and read them in their entirety. So why is ED providing this guidance? Remember that privacy of individual student records is protected under FERPA. To avoid unauthorized disclosure of personally identifiable information from education records, or PII, student data must be adequately protected at all times. For example, when schools, districts, or states publish reports on student achievement or share students' data with external researchers, these organizations should apply disclosure avoidance strategies to prevent unauthorized release of information about individual students. So what are the guidance documents we'll be talking about today? As you can see on your screen, we'll be talking about a case study that we created, talking about minimizing access to personally identifiable information. And we specifically go over practices for access controls and disclosure avoidance techniques, which we'll be talking more about during today's webinar. We also spend some time talking about de-identification and giving definition to the basic terms. As we've traveled around the country or just met with you from various states, it became very clear that a lot of times when we talked about data disclosure avoidance and suppression techniques and other things like that, there wasn't common terminology between state agencies, post-secondary institutions, or districts, so we thought it might be good that we got all on the same page around the definitions. And then we also have a frequently asked questions around disclosure avoidance. So again, why is the Department of Ed defining what many of you may already know? Again, there's many interpretations of common disclosure avoidance terminology. And we also want to provide clarification on the distinction between various disclosure avoidance techniques. So with that, we're going to go into questions with Michael Hawes. So Michael, what is the definition of disclosure and disclosure avoidance?
Thanks, Baron. Well, disclosure means to provide access to or to permit the release, transfer, or other communication of personally identifiable information by any means. Now, often disclosure can be authorized, such as when a parent or an eligible student gives their written consent to share their education records with an authorized party, for example, a researcher or a health provider. But disclosure can also be unauthorized or accidental, and an unauthorized disclosure can happen, for example, as a result of a data breach or data loss. Building on this, disclosure avoidance refers to the efforts made to reduce the risk of disclosure, such as applying statistical methods to protect PII in your aggregate data tables. And these safeguards are often referred to as disclosure avoidance methods, and can take many forms. For example, suppression, rounding, recoding, etc. And we're going to be talking about some more of those later.
Thanks, Michael. What legal obligation do educational agencies and institutions have to protect PII and aggregate reports?
Well, under FERPA, educational agencies and institutions that are reporting or releasing data derived from education records are responsible for protecting any PII in those reports from disclosure. In addition, the reporting requirements of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, also require states to not disaggregate data when publicly reporting achievement results if those disaggregated results would reveal PII about an individual student. ESEA also requires states to select and implement strategies that they will use to protect the privacy of individual students in those reports. But I do want to make a note that when we're talking about disclosure avoidance that needs to be applied to these reports, this is only when issuing your public reports, the things that you are publishing on your website, sending out to the public, and so on. This does not typically apply to any of the reports that you're sending directly to the U.S. Department of Education or to your internal stakeholders.
And is public reporting of data for small groups, i.e. small cells, the same thing as a disclosure?
Well, that's a tough question. Reporting characteristics or counts for small groups, such as the exact number of students that are in a small racial group or the percentage of that group that is proficient on an assessment, may not in and of itself constitute a disclosure. However, the smaller the cell size, the greater the likelihood that someone might be able to identify a specific individual within that cell, and thus the greater the risk of disclosure. Many statisticians consider a cell size of 3 to be the absolute minimum needed to prevent disclosure, though larger minimums like 5 or 10 are often used to further mitigate that disclosure risk. Many people ask what is an appropriate N size for protecting these small groups. Well, there's no real right answer. It all boils down to how much risk of disclosure you're willing to accept, which kind of takes us to our next slide. It's all about risk. The only completely risk-free method of protecting PII in any public release of data would be to never publish any data at all. Anytime you publish information about individuals in public reports, in aggregate reports, you run the risk that individuals might be re-identifiable in that data. So the bigger question isn't can I publish it, but like really how much risk am I willing to accept? Which again brings us to our next slide.
So what standard is used to evaluate disclosure risk then, Michael?
Well, the legal standard for protection of PII from students' education records is what we call the reasonable person standard. Namely, can a reasonable person in the school community who does not have personal knowledge of the relevant circumstances identify a specific individual in the resulting data with reasonable certainty? Now, there's debate as to what constitutes a reasonable person, but generally speaking, we consider it to mean anyone from the community with a basic knowledge of the enrollment and demographic characteristics of the school. Next slide.
So can a reasonable person in the school community who does not have personal knowledge of the relevant circumstances identify an individual in the publicly released data with reasonable certainty?
Right. That is the standard we use, yes.
So does the Department of Education require educational agencies and institutions to use specific data disclosure avoidance techniques, say a cell size of 6, of suppression, for instance?
The department does not mandate any particular method, nor does it establish a particular threshold for what constitutes sufficient disclosure avoidance. These decisions are typically left up to the individual state and local education agencies and institutions to determine what works best within their specific contexts. As a general recommendation, in publicly available aggregate reports, whenever possible, data about individual students, for example, proficiency rates presented as in cross-tabulated tables, they should be combined with data from a sufficient number of other students to disguise the attributes of any specific single individual. When this isn't possible, well, then data about small numbers of students should probably not be reported and should be suppressed. So, which brings us to our next slide. States have a wide variety of options and techniques at their disposal for protecting PII in their public reports. But all of these methods can be boiled down to three basic flavors, if you will, of disclosure avoidance: suppression, blurring, and perturbation. On our next slide, we will talk about suppression. There we go. So suppression involves removing data to prevent the identification of individuals in small cells, or if those individuals have unique characteristics. And there are several examples of suppression as a technique. The most common are cell suppression or row suppression, but it can also involve things when you're dealing with microdata, such as sampling from a broader population. Suppression does have a very big impact on the utility of your data. It can result in very little data being available for small populations in particular, since those are the ones that you'd have to be suppressing. And also, it requires suppression of additional non-sensitive data, also called complementary suppression, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, in order to further protect those cells that are too small to report. Is there any residual risk of disclosure when you use suppression methods? Yes. Particularly because suppression as a technique can be very difficult to perform correctly, especially if you're dealing with large multidimensional tables or hierarchical tables. Applying suppression accurately and effectively through multidimensional tables can be very challenging. Also, if any data is available on that population or on a subset of that population elsewhere, either in related tables or elsewhere in the community, then the suppressed data might be recalculatable, and we'll show an example of that later. Which brings us to our next method, blurring. Blurring involves reducing the precision of the data that you're reporting or presenting in order to reduce the certainty of identification of a possible individual. There are various examples of blurring. You can aggregate across groups. You can report data as percentages or percent ranges. You can top and bottom code your data. So say, for example, greater than or equal to 90%. Or less than or equal to 10%. Or you can round your data to the nearest 2, to the nearest 5, to the nearest 10. Blurring also has a sometimes substantial impact on data utility. The biggest of which is probably that frequently when blurring is used, your data users may then not be able to make very good inferences about small changes in small populations. And also, the data utility is also affected by, in some of these blurring methods, particularly aggregation, it can reduce your ability to perform time series or cross-sectional analyses across schools, across institutions, or across years. Residual risk of disclosure with blurring, generally pretty low, but if you are providing row or column totals in your tables, or if they're presented elsewhere, then it may be possible to calculate out specific characteristics of specific individuals depending on how the blurring is implemented. But generally, the residual risk of disclosure is fairly low with blurring. The third basic flavor of disclosure avoidance, to use that term, is perturbation. Perturbation involves making small changes to the data to prevent identification of individuals with, again, those unique or rare characteristics with any certainty. Examples of perturbation often include data swapping, where you swap certain values on certain variables across individuals. It can involve introducing noise to your data, random deviations from an actual reported value, or it can involve actually generating synthetic data from your protected information, where you essentially you synthesize brand new data that follows the basic characteristics of the population of the data that you're looking at, but without having any specific records for specific individuals. What effect does perturbation have on data utility? Well, it can definitely minimize the loss of utility of your data compared to the other methods, And that's the reason why this is a favored method among statistical agencies, for example. But when you're dealing with program or administrative data, it can really be seen as inappropriate at times because it reduces the transparency of the data that it's based on, which can have various enforcement or regulatory implications. So while it's a favorite method of statistical agencies, you don't often see it in program agencies or administrative agencies because of that transparency effect. Residual risk of disclosure, typically very low, but if someone has access to your algorithms or rules, they can possibly use those to essentially reverse engineer the original data. So there is still some risk, but it is also relatively low.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the upcoming guidance, and we frequently get this question that's listed up on your screen is specifically, will the department release more in-depth guidance on data disclosure avoidance techniques? And the Department of Ed and PTAC are in the process of developing some best practices for states to consider when doing their public reporting, and we're going to talk about some of the draft information that we've come up with so far based on some of the studies we've done. So the first thing to remember is that some of the best practices the department have identified are that specific methods when deciding which disclosure avoidance method to apply in a specific situation. It's important to compare different methods in terms of their effects on the utility of data and the risk of disclosure. The choice of technique will depend on the nature of data, obviously, and also the level of protection offered by this specific method and the usefulness of the resulting data product, which was essentially what Michael was talking about with the utility of data. Student level data, it's important to evaluate whether the proposed release contains any individuals with unique characteristics whose identity can be deduced by the combination of variables in the file. If so, apply disclosure limitation techniques such as data suppression and/or controlled rounding to protect the identity of these students. And then when you think of subgroups, in aggregate public reports or tables, whenever possible, combine data about individual students, such as proficiency rates presented at cross-tabulated tables, with data from sufficient number of other students to disguise the attributes of a single student, such as reporting results for groups of students combined across grades or years. When this isn't possible, it is a best practice to not publish data about small groups of students. Now, when we say those, remember that you still can provide that data back to districts. We're talking about public reports, so I want to make that clarification there. Be sure to consider what other information about those students may also be available within related tables or in related data releases. The more ways that the characteristics of a group of students are sliced and diced, the greater the quantity and precision of the information provided as well, and the greater the risk of finding some combination of those characteristics that uniquely identifies a specific individual. So some of the best practice for access controls and disclosure avoidance techniques are to implement in accordance with your state standards. Periodically review your public reports and data tables to ensure that the disclosure avoidance methods you use are implemented correctly. And then consider checking previously released reports and tables to make sure you applied the disclosure avoidance techniques effectively. Complementary suppression. Most states are using some form of suppression. To protect small groups and those with uncommon combination of characteristics, most states are adopting some form of suppression in their public reports. The challenge with suppression is that suppressed information can often be recalculated by subtracting out the data for the larger reported groups from the all-student totals. This vulnerability can be mitigated by suppressing additional non-sensitive data to prevent those values from being calculated. These complementary suppressions serve to protect the re-identification of individuals in the small group. And Michael's going to walk you through an example here.
Okay, so as we mentioned, suppression of small groups is the most commonly used disclosure avoidance method that we typically see in state reports today, though there is significant variation across states in terms of the details and sophistication of how suppression is being applied. As a simple illustration here, let's imagine a school report card that presents students' proficiency rates on a particular assessment as broken down by race and gender. In this example, let's say that the American Indian subgroup had fewer students than the state's selected N size, so they decided to suppress the data for that subgroup. You'll see the 3 asterisks there under American Indian. Well, I'm not going to show you that often it isn't enough to just protect the PIF for that group, and that simple math can be used to undo those protections. So next slide. First, if you add up the numbers of students for the remaining racial categories, you get 85 students. By adding the data reported for gender, on the other hand, we get 86 students. So it's clear that there is one student in the school who is American Indian. Next slide. Now, if we multiply the reported proficiency rates for each subgroup against the number of students in that group, we can then determine the number of students in each reported group that scored proficient on the assessment. And which brings us to the next one. Finally, if we add up the numbers proficient for each group and subtract it from the total proficient reported for the gender categories, we can easily calculate that the one American Indian student in the school was not proficient on the assessment. Well, so how do we protect that information from disclosure? Well, let's see. By suppressing an additional subgroup, in this case black students, who are the next smallest subgroup in the school, you can prevent re-identification of the protected values for the American Indian subgroup, which was too small to report. This additional suppression is called complementary suppression.
So isn't it sufficient to just strip the student ID name or social security number and give the data out that way? Isn't that de-identification?
Well, we get a lot of questions on de-identification, and I have to say that one of the driving motivations for producing these guidance documents has been to clarify what de-identification actually means, particularly in the FERPA context. Many people falsely assume that if you strip off the names, ID numbers, and other direct identifying information from a file, that the resulting data has been quote-unquote de-identified. This is almost always an incorrect assumption, and has been the cause of a number of inadvertent disclosures, both within the education context, but also with healthcare data, commercial data, and so on. FERPA protects the PII from education records, but PII is more than just those identifiers. It also includes any information that alone or in combination can be linked to a specific individual. So if you've got a series of demographic variables in a file, or course histories, or anything that shows substantial variance across your population, then just removing the identifiers will typically be wholly insufficient to de-identify the data, because individuals could still be picked out through one or more combinations of those unusual or unique characteristics. In all of these cases, additional disclosure avoidance, be it suppression, blurring, perturbation, or some combination thereof, will also be needed to effectively de-identify the data.
So some of the questions we get frequently at the department or at PTAC are around what level of access and who can be provided personally identifiable data, and talking about legitimate need to be able to access the data. And you can see this question is actually a question that we've received at PTAC before. And the best way to illustrate, this area is not specifically any FERPA guidance that says you can or can't, but just because something is allowed or may be allowed doesn't mean it's a good idea. And so I always like to give the example of when I was in Oregon, us taking a look at the folks that had access to student level data. And we actually took a look and reduced the number of people who had access significantly, including myself, even though I was the director of the data systems there. There wasn't a need for me to have access to that level of data. So just because I could didn't mean it was a good idea. The other example I like to give is when you talk about researchers, many of you get a significant number of research requests from PhD students or outside entities for data. And it's really important to develop a process either through your data governance program or through some internal policies on how you're going to give data out for research purposes and actually doing some sort of evaluation on those research requests to determine, one, whether the need for personally identifiable data is truly there. We found, and just through some informal polling with states, we found that probably over half of the requests for personally identifiable data by researchers really aren't necessary. They could do the same data with a lot of the same research with publicly available de-identified or aggregate information. Michael, you have some examples of identifiable data as well, correct?
Yeah, and I reiterate, as a former researcher myself, I reiterate Baron's comment that many of the research requests that come in can be taken care of and be quite sufficiently done with publicly available information that has had disclosure avoidance applied to it. But there are going to be cases, in probably most of your institutions, where somebody with a legitimate research interest comes to you, and they might have a legitimate need to have the unsuppressed or the undisclosure-proofed data for their dissertation or for whatever. And if it's a permittable use under one of the standard FERPA exceptions, well, then you can give them, following the rules, and we have those spelled out in other documents, you can give them access to more identifiable information. But even then, it's really a good practice to not necessarily just give them the keys to the candy shop, so to speak. That you can still put some kind of redaction on those files so that you're not giving them all of the most sensitive data that are in that file. So social security numbers, for example. If you've got a file in your longitudinal data system that has all the student demographic information and social security numbers and names and various sensitive information, you probably don't need to be giving social security numbers to that PhD researcher. So you might consider providing a redacted file where you've stripped out the more sensitive identifiers and replaced them with some kind of unique ID. The file is still protected because it hasn't gone through disclosure avoidance, but it's less sensitive. It's less, there's less risk of re-identification. There's less risk of misuse, let's say, from that file. So definitely think about redacting some of the more sensitive identifiers in those cases where you are making access available outside. Which kind of brings us to this chart here. This is a chart from the Data De-Identification Overview of Basic Terms document that we put together. And it highlights some of the distinctions that we've been talking about here. The sensitivity or risk associated with any given data set can really be thought of as a spectrum. The dividing line, that horizontal dividing line on the chart, represents that reasonable person standard for re-identification that we spoke about before. Everything above that line is protected by FERPA. Everything below the line has gone through disclosure avoidance in one way or another and is deemed safe to release to the public. Within those categories, though, above the line and below the line, there is still variation in the risk associated with the file, the risk of misuse, the risk of re-identification, particularly when you're looking at that protected category. As Baron discussed, it really is a best practice to consider limiting access to the most sensitive data to as few individuals within your institution as actually need to use it. Then provide, as I was mentioning, either redacted or aggregated information as needed to the rest of your organization and your data users.
Okay, with that, a quick reminder to send in your questions. We've received just one question so far, and we have plenty of time for questions and wanted to open up to the group for questions you may have for Michael or myself. If you have specific questions that you don't necessarily want to have on the webinar, please do email the PTAC Help Desk. We take those to what we call our FERPA working group. and determine, one, whether it's technical assistance that's needed, or if there's an official answer needed, and we'll work with you to truly understand the issue and try and get you back the best answer we can. And we also offer site visits, and we are going to be releasing several new documents in the area of data disclosure and privacy, as well as some new and updated guidance specifically as it relates to other areas that we've received as inquiries from the group. So with that, I'm going to pause just for a couple of minutes here while we get the questions together, and then we'll be back on in about 60 seconds. So please do send in your questions.